video, we continue our journey in northwest Illinois along the Chicago Great Western Route from Chicago to Olwine, Iowa, visiting all of the disused stations along the way. This time, we'll focus entirely on the Winston Station and Tunnel, set within the hills of Daviess County. We'll explore this massive yet costly undertaking and achievement for the young railroad, from its problematic inception in the 1880s, its closure in the early 1970s, and now as a decaying monument.
The story of the Winston Tunnel takes us way back into the deepest recesses of prehistory, more than 400 million years ago, when ancient shallow seas laid down thick sediments, which eventually turned to stone and became the ridges, hills, and escarpments of northwestern Illinois. For the purposes of our story, one of the primary bedrock strata laid down was during the geologic period known as the Ordovician, more than 450 million years ago. Then, within a warm, shallow inland sea, tens of feet of calcium carbonates were laid down in sediments from the exoskeletons and shells of trillions of arthropods, mollusks, and diatoms, creating a rock formation known as Galena dolomite, hard, structurally sound stone, often used in building. Millions of years later, the sea receded, and the area became a shoreline, at which point many tens of feet of mud sediments were laid down, which transformed into a deposit referred to as Maquoketa shale, a blue-gray, soft, crumbly rock, unstable when exposed to air and water. After more deep time elapsed, in the Silurian period, the shallow sea returned, once more depositing tens of feet of sediments, which again transformed to dolomite, this time in a deposit known as the Niagara Formation.
Fast forward to the mid-1880s, when a 45-year-old railroad executive, Alpheus B. Stickney, was energetically building a new railway, the Minnesota and Northwestern Railroad, from Minnesota to Iowa, taking advantage of customer dissatisfaction with more established lines, such as the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railway. By 1886, he had already created a railroad from St. Paul, Minnesota to Dubuque, Iowa, leveraging a merger with the Dubuque and Northwestern Railroad. But Stickney's plans did not stop there. He was eyeing the lucrative market of Chicago, 160 miles to the east.
But from the outset, Stickney had a problem. It wasn't getting across the mighty Mississippi, more than a mile across, as he was able to work out an amicable deal with the Illinois Central Railway to use their railroad bridge at Dubuque, Iowa. Rather, it was getting from East Dubuque across Daviess County, with its high ridges and escarpments, formed hundreds of millions of years ago in shallow seas, and which had largely escaped the great leveling of Ice Age glaciers in more recent geologic times. Stickney didn't know it at the time, but this was to be his great white whale, which he was to chase for nearly 2 decades.
While Stickney's surveying and railroad crews built a new railroad from Forest Home, just to the west of Chicago, to South Freeport, the final link to Stickney's railroad puzzle across Daviess County was to take much longer. Multiple routes were initially considered, including one that took the line through Galena, then eastward through Muddy Hollow, then southwest to Elizabeth. However, the route chosen would instead take them south along the Mississippi, sharing space with the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy line, then into Rice Township, then passing beneath a 1,000-foot-high ridge, before passing southwards and then north again to Elizabeth. Railroad engineers had estimated that a tunnel through the Rice Township Bridge would be difficult, but doable, as the area was known to be largely underlain with strong structural stone, dolomites from the Ordovician and Silurian periods. In fact, outcroppings of these light-colored stones can be seen at hundreds of places throughout Daviess County. They estimated that the tunnel would be anywhere from 1/3 of a mile to 1/2 of a mile in length, depending upon the final surveying work and the condition of the tunnel approaches. The tunnel was expected to be a difficult task, but work that the railway's primary contractor, D.C. Shepherd and Company, was confident of undertaking.
The tunnel project was to be largely a Minnesota affair. David Chauncey Shepard, who did much of the contracting work for Stickney's railroad, was a Minnesota-based contractor. Shepard was a native of New York, a wealthy man, and now approaching 60 years of age. Perhaps he needed an energetic junior partner, someone who could be more hands-on with the tunnel project, as well as the Minnesota and Northwestern route from Chicago to Freeport. And so he temporarily partnered with another St. Paul-based contractor, Fendel Gregory Winston, a native of Virginia, who was 25 years Shepard's junior. Together they formed the contracting firm of Shepard, Winston and Company, and they in turn hired other Minnesota-based subcontractors. These contractors and subcontractors did hire some local laborers, but mostly seeded the project with their own cheap immigrant labor from Minnesota, these being Swedes and Finns, with a seasoning of salty Germans. The contract for the tunnel work was signed on March 1, 1887, with an optimistic completion target of November 1st, just 8 months away.
The first carloads of Swedish laborers from Minnesota, numbering 50 or so, arrived in Galena via the Illinois Central Railroad in the first week of March, 1887. Laborers quickly got to work, clearing away timber from the proposed route and preparing the tunnel approaches. The eastern approach was going to require the most work, as they had to create a substantial cut, 1/3 of a mile in length, deep into the side of the ridge. The western approach had its own set of challenges. The cut was to be shorter, less than 1/4 of a mile in length, but then a new ridge needed to be built and ballasted in order to ease the road down grade towards a trestle bridge that would span across a 75-foot deep chasm and more than 200 feet across. The tunnel itself would be on a 1% grade, sloping down from east to west.
The first recorded death occurred less than 10 days into the project. While working on the tunnel approaches, likely the western approach, and that being the death of John Hill, a 31-year-old Scandinavian immigrant who was hauling spoil from the approach cuttings via dump cars using a narrow-gauge trackway. Long wooden poles were used to brake these gravity-powered cars, and while Hill was seated in one of the loaded spoil cars, as it traveled downhill, a brake pole from a nearby car suddenly broke and flew into the back of Hill's head, killing him instantly.
By the first weeks of April, the actual tunnel work began, bolstered by the arrival of 300 or more new laborers. Mining and drilling equipment also arrived by the carload, including air compressors, drilling machines, and pipes. Teams were set up at both ends of the tunnel, the west team drilling east and the east team drilling west. A third work gang was placed at the summit of the hill, about 1,000 feet east of the west tunnel portal and 1,500 feet west of the east portal, boring a hole more than 200 feet deep to the level of the trackway. The shaft would be used for ventilation and to enable miners to dig outwards, east and west, to meet up with the miners working from either end of the tunnel. A steam-powered elevator positioned at the shaft's opening would be used to raise and lower men and materials.
2 more accidents soon marred the tunnel project. In late April, a dynamite charge went off prematurely before a young engineer from Iowa had time to get away. A large stone hit him squarely in the head, knocking him unconscious. But he fortunately recovered hours later. A more serious accident happened a few days later, when a large bank of earth in one of the approach cuts caved in on Albert Helt, a 39-year-old German laborer, who died shortly after he was dug out of the hole. In his passing, he left behind a wife. A later inquiry absolved everyone of blame.
Early on, workers found the tunnel slow and laborious, working through mostly clay and shale deposits. Nonetheless, about 160 small cars of spoil were loaded every hour to be carted out from the site and dumped. But engineers began to realize that they had drawn a poor hand in the tunnel construction, as it was evident that the tunnel was cut directly into the Maquoketa shale layers, not in either the Galena or Niagara dolomites above and below. The hardness of either dolomite layers would have made a strong structure for the tunnel, and they knew how to cut through it and work it using dynamite. Whereas the shale was crumbly, becoming unstable as it was exposed to air and moisture, falling to bits, and had to be worked arduously using a pickaxe.
Labor turnover was high on this project. Men would get injured, become ill, or just walk off the job site. Shepard and Winston continued to hire throughout the summer months, paying $2 per day, plus board of $3.50 per week, which is today roughly equivalent to $85 per day and $150 per week for a food allowance. None but old tunnel men need apply, was the requirement set by their weekly advertisement. Workers would lodge in shanties, local boarding houses, or sleep out under the stars. Nearby Galena saw a wave of drunk and disorderly groups of men coming into their community on weekends to go on a spree, only to have their pockets picked while they were sleeping one off. One Swedish laborer fell asleep in the Illinois Central train depot, waiting for a train to take him home to Minnesota, only to wake up and find that someone had stolen $48 from his pocket, roughly $2,000 in today's money. In late June, more than 60 of the workers went on strike, complaining of the poor food being served to the workers. A few days later, 30 of them bought a train ticket home to St. Paul via the Illinois Central Railroad.
The unstable shale required that the walls and ceiling be carefully braced as they advanced forward. The opening had to be lined with 12-inch timbers spaced 4 feet apart. The gaps between the support timbers were filled with loose stone, and the timber arches were set on steel beams between the timber posts. Further, because of the need for additional bracing, they had to bore the tunnel a few feet wider and taller than expected, significantly increasing the amount of material that they had to cut and remove. After more than 3 months of digging, by late July, the west side of the tunnel had only advanced 300 feet, while the east entrance had only just started. The central shaft team had reached the tunnel level and had managed to bore out 150 feet of tunnel in the middle, leaving more than 2,000 feet of tunnel left to dig.
The extreme heat and humidity of the Midwestern summer was taking its toll on the laborers. Many reported being too ill to work. One young Swedish immigrant laborer, suffering from heat exhaustion, drank a large volume of cold water, then complained of feeling ill before passing away a few hours later. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery were always present in these work camps. Subcontractor J.C. Kohlberg of Minneapolis had just completed his contract work regarding the western approach of the tunnel, but dysentery overtook him at the work camp, finishing him off a few days later in Galena. 26-year-old tunnel worker and Irish immigrant Daniel Carney died of typhoid after falling sick at the tunnel.
Due to the slow progress of the tunnel, rumors were circulating in the camps and local communities that the Minnesota and Northwestern was going to abandon the tunnel, instead either creating a huge open cut across the ridge or rerouting through Galena, Muddy Hollow, and Elizabeth. So rampant were the rumors that the M&NW company officials needed to make official statements that no such alternative plans were being considered in order to quell the rumors.
By the first week of September, the project had made only marginal progress from early July, tunneling a few hundred more feet through the hillside. The original projection for completing the tunnel by November 1st was now abandoned, and they were talking about a January or later completion. 4 sets of workers, 1 at each end and 2 in the middle, were working both day and night shifts to complete the tunnel. Electric lights had been installed within the bore to allow progress through all hours of the day and night.
At the west end of the tunnel, another accident and another death, when 22-year-old Edward H. Hines was killed by a dynamite blast. After a charge was set, a group of tunnelers gathered near the west opening away from the blast area, Hines among them. When the explosion occurred, a large chunk of shale flew out of the tunnel, hitting the unfortunate Hines in the back, just above the kidneys. He was to die in a matter of hours. Weeks later, tunnel miner Josiah Winters was investigating the effects of a dynamite blast in a side galley off the main tunnel shaft but never reappeared. A quick search by workers found him unconscious, overcome by the smoke from the blast. Fortunately, he recovered.
By the end of September, tunneling progress began to quicken. In addition to the wooden supports, they were also bricking over the tunnel interior and expected to use more than 3 million bricks for the project. By mid-October, the tunnelers had achieved the halfway point of the 2,500-foot tunnel. Just a few weeks later, they had cut through another 200 feet, completing 1,400 feet of the bore. Optimism began to spread. The work was either getting easier, or they were becoming more adept at handling the intractable shale.
In anticipation of completion, subcontractors began shipping their horses and wagons back to Wisconsin and Minnesota. Shepherd and Winston, too, were selling off their wagons and horses. Now the Minnesota and Northwestern began openly talking of completing the tunnel by January 1st, with trains running shortly thereafter. Within weeks, in early December, 2 of the 4 teams were able to meet up, breaking through the remaining walls. For their reward, those workers were promptly laid off and paid off, many of them finding their way to Freeport to fill up on whiskey on the way home.
Then finally, on December 22nd, the remaining 2 teams working from the east and west met, creating an opening large enough for them to walk through. In anticipation of completion, photographers and local dignitaries were being given guided tours of the tunnel as the workmen sped through the final tasks of completing the tunnel opening and bracing the walls and ceiling with timber and brick.
The tunnel, 25 feet wide, 30 feet high, 2,450 feet long, and built for a single trackway, was officially completed on Sunday evening, the 1st of January, 1888, 10 months after starting. Contractors Shepherd and Winston pronounced the tunnel ready for iron, turning over the tunnel to the railway with relatively little or no fanfare, which was the custom on Stickney's railroads. Railroad tracks were laid down within a few weeks, and the first locomotive passed through the Rice Township Tunnel on the evening of Thursday, January 19th. This was the last piece of Stickney's puzzle to build a highly competitive railway between Minneapolis, St. Paul, Iowa, and Chicago. In spite of early mistakes in engineering and geology, they had managed to construct the longest tunnel in Illinois at that time. By sheer force of will, Stickney had landed a harpoon in his white whale. But the project had gone significantly over budget, costing the railway more than $600,000, or almost $18 million in today's money. Several people had lost their lives in the endeavor, with many others sustaining serious injuries.
More trouble started within weeks of the tunnel turnover. Groundwater from above was found to be constantly dripping through the tunnel ceiling, and the tunnel drainage was not sufficient to carry the seepage away. The standing water was freezing on the tunnel tracks, and train operators held their breath every time they passed through it during the winter.
Within months, the railway put in a new station east of the East Tunnel portal, referred to as tunnel siding. A U.S. post office with the same name was established there as well. But this stop and post office only lasted a few years, and no longer appeared on train schedules by 1892. During construction, the tunnel itself was referred to as the Minnesota and Northwestern Tunnel. But after the railway transformed into the Chicago, St. Paul, and Kansas City Railway in late 1887, the tunnel took on the name the Rice Township Tunnel, or the Rice Tunnel, a name which it held onto for decades, even into the first part of the 20th century. The Winston Tunnel moniker did not appear until the first few years of the 1900s, and that seemed to be coincident with the reestablishment of the East Portal station stop, which was also reestablished and renamed as Winston in 1903. Why the station was named for Winston rather than Shepherd, who was the senior partner in the contracting firm, is something of a mystery. Perhaps Funda Winston had shown more of a hands-on role in the tunnel project, or perhaps the railway was throwing a bone to the Winston brothers, who continued to do contracting work for the Chicago Great Western after David Shepherd had retired.
The water-related troubles that beset the young tunnel were not solved, however. In the spring of 1891, heavy storms caused widespread flooding in Daviess County, and the tunnel suffered a major cave-in, which buried the west end of the tunnel in mud and shale for more than 300 feet of its length. The cuts of the east and west approaches, too, experienced significant landslides, blocking train traffic. More than 80 laborers in 2 shifts worked tirelessly for weeks to clear the tracks and to bolster the timber supports that lined the tunnel. More timber wall supports and ceiling arches were added at this time. Railroad General Manager John Myers Egan, whom we met earlier during the Egan Station episode of this series, visited the tunnel to investigate the condition of the walls and ceiling. When he alighted from the train in the middle of the tunnel, he sank quickly into the mud that was waist deep. Locals were quick to dub the shaft as the Mud Tunnel.
Tragedies, too, continued to plague the tunnel. During the 1892 cave-in and reconstruction work, a conductor in charge of the work train supporting the clearing of the eastern approach unfortunately ignored the train schedule. The train conductor started backing the train, filled with Italian immigrant laborers, through the tunnel towards Aiken to the west, in order to receive fresh train orders. Instead, the scheduled eastbound train met the work train in the middle of the tunnel in a terrific collision, with a dozen train cars heaped upon one another, causing at least 1 fatality and dozens injured. The Italian laborers almost killed the conductor on the spot. In September of 1896, local newspapers reported that Daniel Landon, an old farmer and resident of Rice Township, threw himself down the tunnel's central ventilation shaft, falling 200 feet to the tunnel floor.
In July of 1900, another cave-in occurred in the tunnel, this time delaying train traffic for several hours. To prevent tunnel cave-ins and approach landslides once and for all, the railway drew up extensive plans to increase the size of the tunnel bore, so as to create concrete walls with a brick lining 3 feet thick. The wood-timbered ceiling was to be augmented with iron arches and a 4-course arched brickwork with a 16-foot diameter. The space between the original arched timbers and the new archwork was to be filled in with concrete. The tunnel floor was to be dug out by an additional 2 to 4 feet, so as to allow for the lowered ceiling, deeper wall foundations, and for a 6-inch concrete resurfacing of the entire tunnel floor, atop drain tiles and stone fill. They would also significantly enhance the tunnel portal openings, with new concrete arches, copings, and side buttresses. The tunnel approaches also would be shored up, with stone retaining walls on both sides of the cutting.
The work for these improvements started in 1902. The firm Lorimer, Gallagher, and Walsh of Chicago was hired as the contractor. However, progress was slow, as they initially had difficulty finding laborers to do the work. Laborers were being compensated $2 per day, while bricklayers were rewarded with $6.25 per day, or $55 and $170 per day in 2022 money. The contractors also had to contend with 12 to 15 trains passing through the tunnel every day, with their contract stipulating that traffic must not be significantly interrupted during the construction. As early work progressed, another accident occurred. In October of 1902, local laborer Frederick, or Fritz, Schoenfeld, aged 19, was killed when he was thrown from a heavy machine that he was operating within the tunnel.
The tunnel reconstruction work continued in 1903. Bricklayers, frustrated with the heavy smoke being generated by the constant train traffic, requested that tunnel traffic be temporarily suspended. Then another cave-in occurred during the tunnel work in June. Although no one was seriously injured, 50 men walked off the job. Reluctantly, the Chicago Great Western agreed to temporarily shift traffic over the Illinois Central lines from Freeport to Portage, so as to enable the sidewalls of the tunnel to be completed. In the weeks that followed, work on the concrete floor started. In order to allow train traffic through while the floor was poured, they blocked up the railroad ties and rails along the approaches and the tunnel above the new floor level. Another 12 inches of gravel ballast was laid over the new concrete floor. By the end of 1903, the tunnel floors and walls and approaches were mostly complete, and the new arched ceiling had just started.
For the ceiling, iron ribs were placed every 5 feet. Bricklayers worked quickly atop boxcars with bricks and fresh mortar passed up from the train car below. Concrete was then used to fill in the gap between the old wooden beam ceiling and the new brick and steel ceiling. As the boxcars were moved quickly in and out of the tunnel with every train passing, the bricklayers were greatly vexed by the residual smoke from these trains. Ventilation was always a problem for the tunnel, and it was going to get worse in the coming years. In spite of these challenges, the tunnel reconstruction was finally completed in the summer of 1904. The more constricted tunnel dimensions were now 16 feet wide by 18.5 feet at the top of the arch. In total, they had used 15,000 barrels of cement, 11,000 cubic yards of gravel, and 2.5 million bricks, at the cost of about $100,000, or about $3 million in 2020 money. The tunnel had finally been given vital finishing touches relative to the 1887 tunnel boring of Shepherd and Winston.
With tunnel traffic now fully opened and double tracking from Galena Junction to Stockton in place, the single trackway of the tunnel was going to present a safety problem for the railroad, as both eastbound and westbound trains would be competing for the same trackway through the tunnel. In 1905, the CGW put into place something called a staff system, a system used elsewhere to protect gauntlet tracks, drawbridges, and train tunnels. Effectively, only trains and their engineers carrying a staff token, a metal key, could pass through the tunnel, and there was only one staff token available at any given time, controlled by the station operators and a special staff machine, one at Winston on the east side and one at Aiken, later Rice, station to the west of the tunnel. A staff key on a hoop was passed to engineers by the station operators as they entered the tunnel area, and then was thrown down on the opposite side to be retrieved by the far end station operator.
By 1908, the railroad that Stickney built was in financial trouble, and the company went into receivership. The railroad was bought by J.P. Morgan and Company, who reorganized it and put Samuel Morse Felton in charge. Whereas Stickney was known as a builder, Felton was seen as a consummate manager of operations. Not surprisingly, Felton's attention eventually turned to the troublesome tunnel in Daviess County, Stickney's Great White Whale, which had cost the upstart Chicago Great Western dearly over the decades. The Illinois Central Railway, too, was hurting the railroad's pocketbook by charging heavy tolls for the CGW trains passing over the IC's bridge across the Mississippi between Dubuque and East Dubuque. Felton was considering new different routes between Stockton and Iowa, including one from Rawdon to Bellevue, Iowa, and another from Stockton to Maquoketa, Iowa, thereby bypassing both the IC's Dubuque Bridge and the troublesome Winston Tunnel. But the prohibitive cost of the new railroad bridge over the Mississippi was not in the plans for Chicago Great Western. Remember that Felton was a manager, not a builder.
Instead, Felton would attempt to fix and improve the tunnel further. There were growing complaints by train operators of the lack of proper ventilation in the tunnel. Ventilation had always been a problem, as the depth of the ventilation shaft had made it impossible for the tunnel to quickly dissipate locomotive smoke. Eastbound trains through the tunnel were most vexed by the smoke, as the steam engines had to work hard heading up the 1% grade through the tunnel, whereas westbound trains could throttle back their engines as they were running downhill. It was said that eastbound train operators and passengers looked like boiled lobsters by the time they reached the eastern portal, and bigger locomotives driving longer trains were making the ventilation problem worse.
Starting in 1912 and extending through 1913, the Chicago Great Western built a massive new ventilation system for the tunnel, drawing air out of the western portal rather than the ventilation shaft, which was now situated about 800 feet from the eastern portal and was about 6 feet in diameter. To do this, they built a powerhouse and fan house on the north side of the western tunnel entrance, backed by a 22-foot-high retaining wall to prevent landslides. The two-story brick powerhouse was 22 feet by 24 feet in dimension and housed a diesel-fueled 180-horsepower engine. Via large belts, this engine drove a fan in a fan house just to the east of the powerhouse.
This was truly a huge fan, 12 feet in diameter, spinning at 170 revolutions per minute, delivering fresh air to the tunnel at 280,000 cubic feet per minute. The outlet of this fan was attached to a newly built giant steel nozzle shroud surrounding the entire western portal, extending out 50 feet from the tunnel opening. When in operation, the new ventilation system blew at nearly 60 miles per hour at the west end of the tunnel and 16 miles per hour at the east portal. Pity the poor bird that happened to fly past the western portal when a train arrived. One wonders, too, what overwhelming sounds the diesel engine, the fan, and the steel nozzle made as the fan spun up to speed. The fan was turned on only when an eastbound train was passing through, and both the east and westbound trains were to limit their speed to 10 miles per hour through the tunnel.
There were two 12-hour shifts for fan operators, which manned the fan house 24/7. Fan house operators typically boarded at the Rice station to the west and would walk 1 mile to the tunnel or ride there via a handcar to start their shift. In fact, the Rice station first appears shortly after the installation of the new ventilation system and may have been located there primarily as a lodging place for both tunnel farmhouse operators, as well as moving the staff system operator there from Aiken. Although this new system generally solved the tunnel's ventilation problem, the troubles persisted, as the ventilation system would often fail due to broken engine belts. During those times, fan house operators would toss a wet towel to eastbound train engineers to alleviate the effects of the train smoke. Passengers, meanwhile, were on their own.
As the U.S. entered World War I, the Great War, in 1917, the U.S. government sought to protect key infrastructure assets, such as railway bridges and tunnels, throughout the U.S., the damage or destruction of which could seriously harm the U.S. economy and ability to wage war. As such, in the summer of 1917, 24 National Guardsmen were put on duty to watch over the Winston Tunnel, thereafter replaced by a small band of railroad detectives after the Guardsmen left in August. Another effect of the war was the constriction of the male labor pool in the area. Remote and rural areas were especially hit, as there were few men to take the available railway jobs.
Fortunately, there was a second half of the population more than able and willing to do these jobs, and in 1917, 18-year-old Hazel Mugen of Rice Township became the station operator at the West Tunnel portal at Rice. She admirably filled this position for many years before being promoted to the station agent at North Hanover, sometime after 1930. In time, she married Oscar Altenburg in 1935, retiring from her railway career in 1941, after more than 20 years of service.
While the Great War raged afar, the tunnel was again showing signs of serious deterioration, less than a dozen years from its last renovation in 1904. Exhaust from the constant locomotive traffic was causing significant degradation of the brick mortar lining the walls and ceiling. Further, the original concrete floor was breaking up due to frost heave and an unstable substrate. Contractors were brought in to spray the brick walls and ceiling with a hot concrete solution, building up a facing layer of concrete 1/4 inch to 1 inch in thickness. A new 12-inch thick concrete slab was also poured beneath the tunnel's rail bed to give the tunnel a solid new floor.
At about this time, another accident occurred at the tunnel, this time taking the life of Leo Clifford Noah of Galena. He had been a railroad employee at the tunnel, working as a section hand along with his father. Both of them were on their way home in early July 1919, but Leo lagged behind. He was later found dead in the tunnel in the late afternoon, lying across the tracks, having been struck by a train.
In 1931, looking for ways to reduce costs on the railway, the Chicago Great Western replaced the staff control mechanism and operators that had been controlling access at both ends of the tunnel since 1905 with a new automated tunnel control system, a CTC, or Centralized Traffic Control Mechanism. This automated system could be controlled by a single operator, who could oversee both the fan and the tunnel access, located at the fan house to the west of the tunnel, using a specially designed signal and switching machine. This enabled the CGW to reduce staff at both the Rice and Winston stations, saving the railroad $7,000 per annum, or more than $80,000 in today's money. This is most likely the time when tunnel staff operator Hazel Mogan moved from Rice to North Hanover.
In 1944, extensive repairs were again made to the tunnel's interior. This time, 2 sections of the tunnel's brick lining, totaling more than 1,200 linear feet, nearly half the tunnel, were reinforced using 8-inch steel ribs set into the concrete and brick walls and ceiling. Most of the repairs were made to the east end of the tunnel, but 200 feet were also repaired on the west end. In 1948, as a result of switching over to diesel locomotive engines, which produced much less heat and smoke while traveling through the tunnel, the CGW shut down the fan house and powerhouse, which had been in operation for 35 years. At this time, they also removed the large steel shroud which enveloped the western portal, and with it removed the fan equipment, the diesel engine, and the diesel oil tank from the north side of the tunnel entrance. The Winston Station to the east of the tunnel was also shut down at about this time.
Perhaps the final tragedy and death to take place at the tunnel was that of local resident Virginia Funston in December of 1963. 38 years of age, Virginia lived with her family close by the tunnel and had been out visiting neighbors, consoling them on the recent death of one of their family members. When her 3 sons returned home from school that day, and not finding her there, they went searching for her, and subsequently found her dead within the tunnel, apparently having been struck by a passing train. The final major repairs to the tunnel took place shortly thereafter, when it was noted that the heavy use of salt to de-ice the tunnel's trackway had caused serious damage to the concrete floor, and as a result, the tunnel floor was again repaired in 1964.
After the Chicago Great Western merger with the Chicago and Northwestern Line in July of 1968, redundant lines were eliminated, including the Dubuque to Freeport route, and the last train to pass through the tunnel was in October of 1971. The tunnel was abandoned and closed up a year later in October of 1972, with a chain-link fence installed across both tunnel portals. The Illinois Department of Natural Resources purchased the land, including more than 220 acres containing the western portal, likely in the mid-1970s, as a satellite of the Apple River Canyon State Park. The Illinois DNR installed new gates to the western portal around 2005 and tore down the western portal's decaying powerhouse and the engine house in 2007 due to safety and liability concerns. The eastern portal land was purchased by a private party in the 1970s, when the former Chicago Great Western right-of-way mostly reverted to local landowners. Those landowners subsequently backfilled much of the Winston Tunnel's eastern portal and the eastern approach.
In Part 2 of the Winston Tunnel, we will explore those remnants of the tunnel that are still visible today, by car, by foot, and through the air, as well as the remains of the large trestle bridge to the west of the tunnel, and other nearby ruins. If you are enjoying these videos, and if you are so inclined, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment. It helps our channel to grow and enables us to make more videos like this. Thank you for watching, and we will see you, in a manner of speaking, in our next video adventure.